It's an exciting time to be in Unama'ki, Cape Breton. We're having an economic renaissance.
You see Grant Thornton there, you see Pearl Vision there, you see these real huge outfits leasing property and office space.
Throughout this series, we'll show you why there's never been a better time to invest in Cape Breton.
You can't imagine a construction site in this province without safety anymore. And so our thought is culture can change.
Welcome back to Invest in Cape Breton. I'm your host, Michelle Sampson. In this episode, we're challenging the idea that Unama'ki Cape Breton is tapped out of talent. There are lots of workers available if you take the right approach to find them. What is that approach? Well, it's embracing a bright idea. That's IDEA. I for inclusion, D for diversity, E for equity, and A for accessibility. Today on the podcast, I'll be speaking with two experts who will reveal the hidden workforce within the island's equity-deserving communities. No matter your industry, you can benefit from embracing IDEA principles. Our first guest is Robyn Lee Seale, the Diversity and Inclusion Lead at Build Nova Scotia. She is working to involve more people from historically marginalized communities in the Cape Breton Healthcare Redevelopment Project through recruitment targets and other initiatives designed to smooth the transition for employers and employees. I asked her to ease us into this conversation with the basics of why inclusion, diversity, equity, and accessibility are important.
So my most kind of practical, pragmatic friend was like, well, the construction industry has to do diversity and inclusion because it's got people, right? As soon as you're working with people, you have to think about what their psychological safety looks like. And what we know is that historically, we've been thinking about that for some people. So now we're working to think about it for all people, thinking about what a woman on a construction site needs, thinking about trans workers and what they might need. We are in a really interesting time with diversity and inclusion work because it's always been important, but now there's a workforce gap. So if you're a union, your job is to keep your union hall full of skilled people who can get the job done. And so I think there is this nice opportunity because for once, it is in everyone's obvious best interest to make these efforts. And so all of a sudden we're looking around and saying, well, who haven't we had at the table and why? The people who are best, in my opinion, at this work, at having inclusive spaces for all kinds of experiences, are the people who are just interested in people as people. When they interview, they go, ooh, this person's going to bring something really important to the table. That's why I'm hiring them. What does it take for me to make that shine? That's why idea work is important because we all want to provide psychologically safe workplaces for our employees. We know that they're going to stay longer, and we're all humans who deserve a good experience. That's what we're trying to do.
The other expert featured in this episode is Nadine Bernard, the founder and CEO of Indigivisor, an Indigenous inclusion consultancy that helps businesses and governments, large and small, with recruitment, retention, policy recommendations, outreach, and communication and engagement strategies. For Nadine, IDEA is about aligning corporate community values with the actual communities they're in.
From a topical standpoint, it's just good practice, especially if you're going to be doing work in their traditional territory, especially here in Cape Breton and anywhere in Nova Scotia. At some point, you're going to have some touch point with Indigenous people. Indigenous people are the original people of this traditional territory, and we're bound by treaties. So we're the only people in Canada that have a legally binding agreement with the Crown of this country. And so when you look at how you build relationships with Indigenous people, you want to go in being truthful and honest in what your intentions are for whatever project or initiative that you're wanting to introduce and how you want them to be a part of the project and how could they be a true partner in these projects?
Hopefully, the why of an IDEA approach is now crystal clear. Next, I wanted to find out how big this hidden workforce is.
If you look at the groups in our construction industry recruitment target, I think they make up over 70% of the people looking for work in Nova Scotia, right? Women, people with disabilities, people of color. Our biggest growing populations in Cape Breton are what? The Mi'kmaq population, the immigrant population. These are brilliant, talented, skilled people. You just have to think about how you bring them in. You just have to do your best to think about their perspective, right? What does it feel like if they're the only person from that community in the room? If we're not asking those questions, then people from other experiences aren't going to come work for us, and nor should they. But if we ask ourselves what those experiences might be, we can have these whole populations potentially starting to get interested in us and starting to bring their skills and their time and their different outlooks.
Robyn Lee warns against making assumptions about what a particular group might bring to a workplace. They could be bringing skills and outlooks that you don't expect.
If you're hiring from an underrepresented group, your first job is to step back and say, I don't want to put a big expectation on this person. I want to be open to what they're bringing. Imagine if you were hiring a woman for the first time and you thought, oh, we're going to learn about maternal things. We're going to learn to be soft, right? And then she's a woman in the construction industry who's had to fight her way to get in the space. Maybe that's not what she's bringing at all. So we just don't want to over prescribe what that's going to be.
As Robyn Lee mentioned earlier, the island's Mi'kmaq communities are growing. Nadine says we don't have data on exactly how big the Indigenous talent pool is, but there are 5 substantially populated Mi'kmaq communities on the island with workers who are racking up education and experience.
We're seeing more an uptake in engineering, which is great, and which we hadn't really seen. Some civil, some structural, some electrical engineering. More are going into archaeology, more are going into architecture. So that technical training, which is really good, project management, project coordination. My daughter just recently finished a 6-week program with construction in Nova Scotia, to try to build the capacities of a workforce here who could, have transferable skills to be able to meet the demand of some of these specialty besides just trades. Then we have a slew of them as well, because we've been trying to train our community members to be ready and prepared to meet the demands. So we have welders, we have pipe fitters, we have electricians, we have plumbers, concrete fitters, some heavy equipment individuals as well. And, that's really nice to see that people are willing to diversify how they present themselves as being ready and able and trained to be able to meet the labor needs within the island. Mind you, there's lots of projects happening within their own, like they're building up their own infrastructure within community. And I think that's where that shift of some challenge of labor force availability. It's not that we don't have the people. It's now that they're just so busy because, our communities are starting to build their own infrastructure within their communities.
For those skilled and talented Indigenous workers who are looking for opportunities, Nadine says there are challenges that government and corporations could help them overcome. One of those challenges is geography.
You got to think about transportation and location of some of these communities. The whole point of creating these Indigenous communities was to be out of sight, out of mind. So they put them in places a distance from urban areas. Membertou has the advantage of being housed right in the center of Sydney. But then you've got Eskasoni, that's still about 45 minutes away, and Wamacook and Waikabam, Botlek are the same. And because of the jurisdictional barriers of it, Indigenous communities, Mi'kmaq communities are federal lands. We don't have the same accessibility to some transportation options like buses. So you have to be creative in your own community to address those transportation issues, which our communities are starting to address and be proactive on, creating their own transportation lines, whether it be for post-secondary or for employment. But at the same time, it's still the same responsibility of the provincial and municipalities in being able to overcome these barriers. And how do we create some kind of partnership system that doesn't look at this as jurisdictional?
Are you seeing any companies trying to fill that gap?
Not that I know of, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's not happening. Anytime we work on these large scale projects, that's the first thing we talk about. Let's start to think outside the box now before we start trying to recruit and before we start to try to bring people to this project. Let's think of every risk analysis scenario on what could make it challenging for an Indigenous workforce or business to be able to participate.
Another workforce recruitment challenge Nadine has seen is unique to the Indigenous context.
From an Indigenous employee standpoint, one of the challenges is competition with the community. So there's some federal legislative regulatory things that when they work within the community, their income isn't taxable. And so when you're asking them to leave that, then their income is taxed, and then it's a reduced income coming into their household. So to entice someone to leave from working within their community and invite them to want to work on something outside, you really have to be creative on how you create those enticing strategies to bring them out.
And are you able to speak to any of those enticing strategies?
You have to think of like, how willing is the company or organization or entity willing to think outside the box? Are you open to creating a partnership with said First Nation community and have them work in community at a satellite sub office, maybe 2 days a week? So they're still within their community. They still have accessibility to language and culture, which is really important. Or, partnership arrangements, right? So moving your corporate office onto a First Nation community, which you're seeing, right, with a lot of these new leasing partnership opportunities that are come up, and even in Membertou. I mean, you see Grant Thornton there, you see Pearl Vision there, like you see these real huge outfits leasing property and office space within First Nation community. Then you don't have to modify anything. You're right there on First Nation lands. And that's only because now Indigenous communities are able to move towards self-sustaining initiatives like having these leasee spaces and building the infrastructure to invite those external people to come into community.
Of course, working with Indigenous communities is about more than just leasing space within them.
They need to acknowledge and understand that our communities work like a web, right? There's tribal organizations that represent communities and that support them in building their capacity, meeting their needs, building training programs. And so utilizing these partnerships and understanding what all of these Indigenous organizations do, like what's their mission statement, their foundation of what they offer as services, and building those relationships so that they're helping you. I mean, you have this Atlantic initiative happening between MIBO, the Mi'kmaq Economic Benefits Office, CAN, Mi'kmaq Rights Initiative on the Millbrook, and JEDI and the federal government, and talking about how do we build up a directory for not only Indigenous businesses, but an Indigenous workforce so that people can say, this is what I'm looking for. Who do you have in your pool? How can you prepare a workforce for us to meet the demand that we're looking for? So I would just say, get to know your organizations and communities, and that synergy that happens naturally within our Indigenous communities, you can then be a part of.
Already, there are some corporations that have done this work and are models for how to engage in economic reconciliation that truly builds wealth and sustainable opportunities for Indigenous communities. Nadine gave 2 examples of companies that represent reconciliation. The first is Everwind Fuels, which is working with Mi'kmaq communities as equity partners to build an Atlantic Canadian green fuel hub. The second is Clearwater Seafoods. Back in 2020, 50% of this major player in Nova Scotia's fishing industry was sold to a coalition of Mi'kmaq First Nations. The partnership will generate wealth and so much more.
Back in early January, Chief Terry Paul talked about the profits and revenues being triple to what Clearwater has ever seen before. And especially in an industry that was our enemy. The reason of like 2 decades, if not more, of a very fractured relationship with industry in Canada and Indigenous people when it came to treaty rights. And so to see the Mi'kmaq people be the partners of what used to harm, and now they're a part of, the decision making of it, that's the true action, is that there was an industry that was willing to not think about the politics, but said, we want to be partners with you. You, of all people, deserve to have a shared part of the wealth that comes from an industry that actually originally belonged to you.
On the flip side, some companies may think they're engaging in reconciliation, but aren't getting it quite right. Nadine has advice.
You see some that just don't come in the right way. The overuse of engagement can be confusing for people, sometimes consultation as well. We always say big C, little c, we don't do big C, we do little c. And even to use that word can get intimidating, because then it comes into the legal sense of checking a checkbox to meet those requirements. But it's relationship building. It's getting to know the people and getting to know what their priorities are and how do you align what you want to what the community wants. And don't assume that just because you're coming in flashing an opportunity that that's what they want.
Implementing IDEA principles as a private corporation can be tough. Implementing them as a crown corporation in collaboration with many partners, that can be tough too. For the CBRM Healthcare Redevelopment Project, Build Nova Scotia saw diversity and inclusion as both a responsibility and an opportunity to transform the local construction industry. I asked Robyn Lee Seale to explain why this initiative got off the ground and how they're implementing it.
We work in the Cape Breton Regional Municipality, a relatively small region, and before the pandemic, our healthcare infrastructure redevelopment investment was valued at over $1 billion. So it's a huge economic investment in such a small region. And so the government, the community, and the construction industry was all aware that if we weren't thoughtful about how that money was invested into the projects and how those projects were developed, we could really predict who was getting the economic development dollars, like who was benefiting the most. In Cape Breton, it's much like a lot of the construction industry. It's typically dudes, typically white men. And we all thought we could do better if we built a diversity and inclusion program that started to shift the industry to include more representation from women, from people of color, from Indigenous people, from Black people, from people with disabilities, from immigrants. All the people who should be there, but aren't necessarily yet, or aren't there in the numbers yet that we want to see them in. The opportunity we saw as Build Nova Scotia, so the representatives of government, is putting a little bit of pressure on the ecosystem of the construction industry in our region. And so if you want to be a contractor on our projects, you are committing to a recruitment target, getting at least 10% of your workforce hours from underrepresented groups, and 25% of your skilled apprentice hours from apprentices. So we need to see you training new people as well. And a percentage of those, again, should be from underrepresented groups. So the first thing we're doing is putting in the pressure. The second thing we're doing is saying, okay, well, we're asking you to change what your workforce looks like. How can we support that? And how can we do that in a sustainable way? And so we have a lot of inclusion efforts that we're developing. And we do this with a diversity working group. There are representatives from all of the groups in our target. And we meet with them monthly. We are as transparent as possible, which means we put so many more hours into data than I ever expected to. And we're accessible to them. And we do our best to adapt our processes. So when they say, hey, can it be like this? If we can say yes, we do. We're also working to increase the capacity for inclusive workspaces on our construction sites. We're developing tools. We have the Inclusive Language Site Manual. My site inspector does this. He's on site. Someone says a word, maybe someone says colored. I still hear that one occasionally. And he goes, are we saying that? Let me get the manual, looks in the manual, reads the explanation. It's not just don't say that, and says, oh, but we're not saying that anymore. Here's why. So more inclusive spaces. We're building a program called the Respectful Site Champion Program, hopefully launching early to mid-fall. That's about making sure we have clear pathways for if something happens, how that's reported and discussed, and also growing the capacity of the leaders on site to have these conversations. Because if you've never had a trans person on your site before, or if women typically haven't been reporting sexual harassment, well, how are we supporting you to deal with that? And finally, this is really important. When we think about what capacity building is, it's making sure that the communities and the industry are connected. So our target pushes you there. And if you're not meeting your target, we direct you to representatives from the community. Because I could be gone tomorrow. I could win the lottery. Government could change and they could just decide we're not doing this initiative anymore. But if the contractors are connected to the industry, if industry supports are connected to equity deserving communities, capacity is being built.
What Robyn Lee and Build Nova Scotia are trying to accomplish represents a major culture shift. If you're thinking that construction companies are complying under duress and that the culture can't be changed, you might be surprised.
In 1992, we had the West Ray mine disaster. That drove a shift in how Nova Scotia legislates safety, right? And so when we were working in Nova Scotia to change safety culture, everyone was like, it can't be done. It can't be done in Cape Breton. It can't be done in Nova Scotia. Well, in fact, it has been done. It's been done beautifully. I work with people who are leaders in this industry who said, oh yeah, but when we started, you wouldn't have seen us tied on if we were up high. Like that wasn't cool. We didn't even understand that that was more safe. We thought maybe we could just jump. And so it's been decades of a combination of legislation and education and enforcing expectations. And now safety reports are standard and expected. It is embedded. You can't imagine a construction site in this province without safety anymore. And so our thought is culture can change. And we can also be more psychologically safe. Part of psychological safety has to focus on diversity, equity, and inclusion, because otherwise it's just going to capture psychological safety for the people who've always been centered. And so there's this hunger in the construction industry because they just saw a culture shift. And they're like, girl, get in here. Some of these meetings I show up to and they're like, oh, Robyn Lee, we're so glad you're here. And I'll say something like, I want to run this program. And they're great, we're ready.
If you're a business owner or investor in any industry that's ready to prioritize diversity, equity, and inclusion, that's fantastic. I asked Robyn Lee if there are any common mistakes organizations make when they're just getting started. There are a few that came to mind.
One thing we did in our project that was important is, targets are tricky. And we learned on a previous project in our region that if you have targets based on people, it becomes a checkbox. So our targets are based on hours worked. So if you bring in that one Black guy and you only have him there for 2 hours, well, that's only 2 hours. And so if you're doing anything to do with targets, you want to have a lot of conversations with a lot of people. But one thing we learned is to make it hours based to get around tokenism. Also, I think one of the key mistakes people make is not having solid mentors. If you're in charge of running a whole company, who trained you to do diversity and inclusion work well? I bet no one did. And that's just where we are. So you need to have a couple of mentors, people you can be vulnerable with, people who can call you out. If you want to get into this work at any level, I think that is a key step. I also think where we see the most success is the people who know how to get over their own defensiveness. What I like about the construction industry is that they might not always be used to the language we use around diversity and inclusion, which isn't as important anyway, right? But they know about conflict resolution. They know about having hard conversations. They know who's good at it and who's not good at it. And so the people I've seen succeed are the people who don't take things personally, who trust that if we're rational together, we're going to figure this out, who practice perspective taking. I have a coworker who was really, really touched because our director called him to see how he was doing in Snowmageddon. And my director said, well, just thought to myself what would it be like to be from East Africa and find myself in a snowbank, and thought I should check on him. But lots of people don't take the time to put themselves in another person's shoes. So I think these are the things that are making it work.
Robyn Lee added that the number one thing organizations do wrong, including Build Nova Scotia at first, is not reaching out to communities soon enough. As Nadine Bernard mentioned earlier, reaching out and talking to people directly can reveal information that you never would have anticipated. Robyn Lee experienced one of these surprising discoveries personally.
I came to the job with a lot of connections in the immigrant community, but I realized I didn't have any connections to the Filipino Cape Breton community. And so a member of the Equity Network, New Dawn's Nadine connected me to her brand new staff person who was from the Philippines, Sheni Daskul. We crashed the Filipino Association Christmas party, and she introduced me to people who were interested in the construction industry. And here's what we learned. The language score you need to do trades at NSCC is really high. It is prohibitively high. And so the Filipino people who were trying to do trades were going to NSCC and they couldn't get in. And so what they told me as children screamed around us and a live band played at the Christmas party is, I can't get into NSCC because I wasn't born in Canada, so I can't get into trades. So because we were taking that relational approach, we get to see that there was an understanding gap. You don't have to go to NSCC to do trades. It's a great path, but if you can't get in, there are other paths. So the two men we met who were able to so clearly communicate with me in English that I could understand them in this hectic scene were able to get into carpentry training and do direct entry. So the relational approach directly got workers, but it also, we're hoping it's beginning to show that community that they can work with the trades.
So, as an employer, how do you connect with these communities, aside from crashing their Christmas parties?
you just want to connect to the local people. There are lots of good people you can start with. So get connected to local Mi'kmaq organizations, the local EDOs and NEOs at your band offices, that sorts of things. If you're working in trades in Mi'kmaq, call MEBO. If you're starting with the LGBT community, start with Veronica Merrifield. The Black connections might be harder, but there are people like me who can get you connected to the right people. We have an equity network here. They're working exactly to do this, exactly to help people connect to the workforce and underrepresented communities. If you call me, only call because you expect to be connected to a lot of people. If I don't connect you to a lot of people, tell me I didn't do my job.
Links and contact information for all of the above are available in this episode's show notes. Both Robyn Lee and Nadine are doing this work with one eye on the present and another on the future. For Nadine, her vision of a fully realized, inclusive, diverse, equitable, and accessible workplace is one where an Indigenous worker is hired based on their merits and feels welcome from the start.
It shouldn't matter that you're Indigenous and that they're going to create an opportunity for you. It's that you have a passion for something or a skill set that you'd like to share and be able to expand and not have to worry about some of the cultural challenges that can come with inviting diverse individuals into these spaces and places, which is what the reality of what we have to think about now. I'm a mother and a grandmother, so I want to contribute to dismantling all of those pieces that make it challenging for when my granddaughter is able to enter that workforce. And so I have to think that far ahead. But as Indigenous, we think 7 generations ahead. I don't know if in my lifetime I'm going to see that point where she can just walk in and be, but I hope I do. And, I want to do my part in that process of dismantling.
The CBRM Healthcare Redevelopment Project is one of several included in the Cape Breton Partnership's Building Tomorrow campaign, which aims to encourage positive long-term spin-offs from these projects, like a stronger workforce and a rejuvenated local construction sector. I asked Robyn Lee to imagine a time after construction is done and what she hopes the legacy of these projects will be.
I mean, we are getting really beautiful healthcare facilities that have been built with an immense amount of input from healthcare providers to make sure that they're doing their best to serve needs. Not one of us won't be touched by the cancer center. Not one of us won't be touched by these hospitals. They're really, really important. However, my eye on the prize is not those buildings, because we have a chance for generational impact and generational change. So my hope is that contractors and community will be more closely connected, that communities will have more of their people working on their sites, because you can't be it if you can't see it, that the view of who can be on a construction site will change, both for the people who are like, oh, maybe it can be me, maybe I can be a woman in trade, but also that the people working on these sites would never want to imagine or remember, oh, these women weren't always here, these people of color weren't always here. We're so grateful they were in the room. That's my goal. And that the people working on our sites are having equitable and inclusive experiences, that they feel they belong, that they're not having to hide part of who they are, not talking about their husband because they don't want people to know they're gay. It means if you're Mi'kmaq and you're going to practice St. Anne's Day, you don't have to do a lot of explaining. Maybe your team is like, hey, St. Anne's Day is coming. Do you need Thursday off or whatever? It means that if you are a woman and you have a wife or a trans wife or you're a trans woman, you can talk about it at work. Also, that the people who haven't traditionally been there don't have to work twice as hard to prove themselves. Something I hear in the construction industry a lot is, oh, I've got this woman on my site and she outworks all the men. And it's true. I know she does. And I want her to not have to. Like, that's the next level.
That would be a great place to end this episode. But I always end an interview with a simple question. Any final thoughts? Robyn Lee had some great ones, both for prospective investors and the island's local employers.
To people not on this island yet, I hope you come here with a whole heart, ready to enjoy our culture and enjoy our beauty and to respect it and love it the way we do. And to the local people, I want to say we're already doing diversity. You probably already have people from the 2S LGBTQIA plus community in your workplace. You probably already have people with disabilities in your workplace. So please also remember that as we make these efforts, it's actually going to open up space for the people you already are valuing. And the final thing I'll say is we often talk about making sure that your skills match your values. So you think you're a good person and you think you value your human workforce. Do you have the skills to do that when the chips are down? When someone comes to you and says, hey, that meeting was actually problematic. Are you still the person who can listen, who can think, who can get over the defensiveness and provide that psychologically safe space? So think of diversity and inclusion work as human work that helps you develop the skills to live up to your values.
Thank you so much to Robyn Lee Seale and Nadine Bernard for sharing your expertise with us. Check out the show notes for links to their organizations and others mentioned in this episode. Next time on Invest in Cape Breton, we're going sector-specific and talking about the incredible investment opportunities in this island's tourism sector. Hit that follow button on Apple Podcasts or Spotify to be notified when it drops. If you've been enjoying the podcast, while you're there, it would be great if you could leave a rating or review. Our theme music is Under My Skin by Glace Bay's own Elise Aaron. Invest in Cape Breton is produced by Storied Places Media, a proudly Cape Breton-owned business operated by me, Michelle Sampson. Thanks for listening.